Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Word is Bond podcast, hosted by the Bond Educational Group. Each Friday at noon, we interview leaders, education, thought persons just across the sphere around equity, diversity, and inclusion in our industry. I am Dr. Becfrida Jackson, the Director of Research and Grant Administration for the Bond Educational Group, and I will serve as a moderator for today's discussion. Now, before I introduce our esteemed guests, I really want to remind everyone that our Equity Summit is quickly approaching. It's February 8th through the 10th, 2022. The event will be 100% virtual, so be sure to go online and purchase your ticket at www.equitysummit.com. Our theme for this year is Rising Together, and we're even more excited about our speaker lineup for this year. So for more information, definitely do hit up our website at www.theequitysummit.com. Now, for today, I am super excited to introduce our speakers and our presenters for this conversation. We have Miss Alana and Miss Jessie, and they are in fact the co-founders of Making Menches. Now, I'm going to let them kind of step us through this social justice conversation because I'm just super excited for us to tackle this afternoon. How do we have natural touch points when we introduce this social justice dialogue? Where are spaces of inclusion? How can we create spaces of inclusion? And I would say Elena and Jessie have done an absolutely phenomenal job with the creation of their organization that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the principles that are driving their organizational work. We're going to talk about their community vision and drivers as well. And what we really seek to do is how do we, and what we want to think about is how do equity and inclusion enter our life spaces? How do we think about equity and inclusion? How does it personally touch us? But how does it also professionally touch us? I think our conversation for today with Making Mentions, they hit both of those spaces. They give us the opportunity to do both and, which is phenomenal. The either or is kind of that dichotomous approach. As from an equity space, we want both and. We want the diunidal conversation. And so with the introduction of Making Mentions for today's dialogue for this podcast, we really hit there. So without further ado and mention, I like to introduce our co-founders of Making Mentions, Miss Elena and Miss Jessie. Please, if you can introduce yourself and step us through the great work that you all are both doing.
Yeah, thank you so much for having on the podcast today. We're so excited to be here. I'm Ilana. I use she, her pronouns, and my co-founder is...
I'm Jessie. I also use she, her pronouns.
And we would love to just walk y'all through the genesis of Making Menches and how we started and what sort of work we're doing. So I'll let Jessie start us off.
So a little over a year ago, after the murder of George Floyd, I, like many others, were spurred to action, specifically in my community. So I kind of Googled around until I found this incredible letter that was written. I don't know if they were a group then, they are a group now, entitled Not Free to Desist, which refers to a quote from the Torah. It says, you are not obligated to complete the work, but you are not free to desist from it either. And so this group was primarily composed of Jews of color who wrote an open letter stating step by step what Jewish organizations need to do to become more equitable in the next 3 years. So I found this letter. I was like, this is amazing. This is a step-by-step guide of what we should be doing. What are synagogues doing? So I reached out immediately to my home temple that I had grown up in that community. And they were kind of like, we've never heard of this at all, but we're interested and we don't know what to do. So through means, I ended up reconnecting with Alana. We went to the same synagogue growing up, and we found out we lived really close to one another. And we were like, we're both deeply invested in this work in our own lives, so let's bring it to our community.
Yeah, and so once Jessie and I connected and sort of found out that we were doing similar work in different spheres. Jessie is an educator. I am pursuing a master's in social work, but also have done education work. We were like, okay, how can we bring this to specifically our own community? So we really wanted to center our work around other white Jewish spaces and how we can work to make those more inclusive to Jews of color, following the guidelines laid out in the Not Free to Desist letter. So very much like affinity space-based work.
That's phenomenal. So super excited just to have the conversation today about, I think what you said something that was brought to the fore around specific discourse of resistance, a letter that was a vision, that was a driving point, that was phenomenal. And, facilitating conversations. When we talk about DEI, we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice too, because I like to tag justice onto that phraseology. Conversations about the systemic nature of anti-racism, Blackness in Jewish spaces. And I think when thinking about the work that the two of you have put together and are doing, I think of that at the crux and at the core of that conversation. So, you've talked to us about where you began, how you began, which is phenomenal, how your idea was born, the vision and the work. Um, I'd say pivoting a little bit, talking about the terminology at the crux of this conversation. When you think of the word equity, when you think of the word inclusion, what most immediately comes to mind for you, and how would you define it? And specifically, for your work, how integral are these concepts, especially in ensuring the success of the conversations that you seek to facilitate? Because you also do workshops and really garner a lot of community grassroots activism. So I would love to hear more about that because that's such a natural touch point as we evolve this social justice conversation.
Yeah, we love that question. And like workshops are really almost our main focus just because like we want to make sure that these conversations remain very community and grassroots oriented, again, because we are two white women facilitating these conversations with other white people. So like we're not here to profit off of the work. And we can talk more about that with our practice later. But when we think about equity and inclusion, like that's very much the focus of our work. And I think that we've talked about like equity being like everyone getting the resources that they need, not just to survive, but to thrive in the spaces that they're in and the communities that they're in. And inclusion really being about feeling safe in the spaces that you want to be a part of. And so that's really the two things that we try to champion at Making Menches and that we're doing these workshops to achieve is equity and inclusion in our Jewish spaces.
Yeah, and one example that we came to early on with doing this research, because once again, none of this came originally from us. We are purely building on the work that has been done for decades, for generations, really, was the issue of security in Jewish spaces, because this came up a lot around some harm done to Jewish communities and the kind of desire for more police or state-backed, protectors in the sense of the white Jewish lens at any sort of Jewish function or Jewish services, and how this actually stood as an inhibitor for many Jews of color and for many marginalized people entering the space, and how one bad interaction with the police at the door of your synagogue will ensure that that congregant never comes again. And so that was one example of how kind of we're looking at not just protecting white Jewish feelings of safety, but really ensuring that the community is safe and that the building is safe for all Jews to enter, not just to worship there, but to enter and feel that this is my community.
So we just want to highlight that as like an example of like applying equity and inclusion and like how that shows up in Jewish spaces.
No, that's awesome. And I think when we think of the word equity, we think of I think of the evolution of the term, because when we think of this work, we think of the application of this work, we think of the trajectory that this work has taken. We all used to feel comfortable with the word equal. And we also used to say, oh, well, it's all equal. And then you saw the pivot, you felt the shift around from equality to equity. And I love how you settle in about we're talking about resource allocation and making sure that the playing field is in fact leveled. And that's how we've seen this work evolve in a way that is intentional in scope, very targeted in scope, when we're not just talking about, oh, well, things are equal, isn't everything good? And we're like, no, that's not what we mean. We're talking about leveling that playing field, ensuring that there's resource allocation and that there's parity in a way that we haven't seen it previously. We're no longer as comfortable, and I think that's the key terminology, as comfortable with the word equality. We're forcing the hand around the word equity, but also around the practice of equity and what that looks like. What are tangible solutions and outcomes, and how equity, how it looks, how it feels, all of the above. So I really appreciate the example that you both provided around equity, but then also its application from how we define safety. What does that look like? That's a well-being sphere. And so, in talking about the natural touch points of inclusion and inclusive spaces, we have to think about those things as well. So super excited to hear and to really appreciate the example that you shared. So when we think about, or I think about your organization, and intentionally the word anti-racism comes to mind, especially in not just in the vernacular, but also too in the literature that we read on your website as well. So what is your vision for the application? And I'll often say the application discourse is amazing. However, the application is really where we get to the meat when the rubber meets the road, right? So what's your vision for the application of anti-racist practice and praxis? Because there's an aspect of your work that I greatly appreciate that's rooted in rhetoric. Where you started was from rhetoric. You started from a letter. You evolved from a letter. So to hear more about your vision around the application of anti-racist praxis and practice would be awesome.
Yeah, so I think as we talked a little bit about earlier, we definitely feel like our specific vision around anti-racism as to white Jewish women is not particularly relevant because like we are not dictating the conversation on anti-racism, nor should we. So we really draw on the vision of Jews of color, like April Baskin. Who else do we?
Udvila McCoy, Lacey Schwartz Delgado are all incredible Black women who have been promoting their vision for what equity and inclusion looks like in the field. April and Baskin worked for the Union of Reform Judaism and created the Audacious Hospitality Program, which literally is just PDFs of like 40 pages of resources and tools to use in your community to make sure you are serving everyone around you, and these tools are sitting there waiting to be used. And I mean, that's more personal, but in my growing up in these communities, I didn't see any of them really applied. So when we approach anti-racism, we're really building on what Jews of color are saying they need and saying would be most equitable in these spaces. So we're trying to kind of decenter the whiteness of, you know, white activists or white anti-racist educators kind of projecting their vision on it, because we don't have lived experiences, people who have been discriminated against in that way.
Yeah, like definitely trying to move away from the Robin DiAngelo theme of like profiting and like thousands of dollars off of anti-racist practice as white people, because that's just really a continuity of oppression. And so I think when we're talking about like our vision for like the application, what we're really thinking about is like, how can we ask these like affinity spaces of other white Jews to take actionable steps within our communities, and how can we be learning with them, and also like sort of providing guidance on like actual steps that can be taken in the community to make a difference. So like collaborating with Jews of color who are doing this sort of diversity work to come in, lead conversations, or specific conversations around hiring practices and like who's hired and where money is going to, and like working with them on curriculum changes to like input anti-racist information into curriculums, and like even what the textbooks that we're looking at look like, you know, when we're sitting in Hebrew school as like young children, only having one specific image in our textbooks of like what a Jewish person looks like. And that's like a very base level thing, but also is incredibly impactful for like a young Jew of color who might be sitting in a classroom and never have any representation for themselves. So like, what does it look like to like actionably shift things in these spaces?
Oh, that's excellent. You're shifting the narrative. You're, creating the conversation, forcing the hand around the dialogue. And we'll often talk about just in our education spaces, especially, what our textbooks, what our history books have looked like. I was having an interesting conversation most recently about the Mint Julep textbook, and how what history has been painted to look like. And so I think that your response relative to the infusion of an anti-racist dialogue, it's expansive in scope. in terms of the application, it is examining our histories. It's examining visually what we're seeing. It's examining, it's really dissecting and deconstructing pedagogy in a different kind of way. It forces us to open our eyes and to, truly, be very intentional about how we do our pivot around, okay, so this is what the application looks like. This isn't just the lip service towards creation of a culture. And we'll close out part of the discussion about creation of culture and kind of how that needs to look. But before we head in that direction, I am very intrigued and interested about the principles that are at the crux of your organization. And so I'm actually gonna reference them for our audience so that they're familiar with them. But again, want to, as you've provided due most credit to, that the principles themselves are lifted. They're lifted from an existing space already, from the not free to desist, which was in fact, in full complement, an open letter from Black Jews, non-Black Jews of color, and allies to Jewish federations, foundations, and organizations and initiatives. And I think it's mission critical to cover that full space in terms of who's represented in that rhetoric. And this was around June 2020, if I'm did my homework correctly. So in terms of the principles, the first principle is say the words Black Lives Matter. The second principle, pillar of racial equality. Third principle, anti-racist hiring and compensation. And I did hear you both share that when we're talking about the application, we're talking about everything from curriculum development to recruitment and retention. What does that look like? And so I see that living as a living principle as well. Fourth principle, anti-racist education and curriculums. Again, the application, which is excellent to see. Number 5, JOC and POC leadership development. And after I step through the 7 principles, I'll be, ecstatic to hear from the two of you as we kind of step by step talk through those principles and, where the trajectory and the vision for them. The principle 6 is racial justice requirements for grantees. And then closing out the 7th principle, fully funded support and accountability. So in thinking about the principles and saying those principles out loud, and it's so funny because you'll often hear when you utilize more than one sense, it helps to embed and internalize the concept even more. And so, for our audience, sharing the principles and in fact, reading them on your website, it's extremely impactful. But in exploring the principles, how did you land on these principles? And then also, two, the actionable spaces for each principle, kind of one by one. I think we've talked through a couple, so feel free to revisit those if you like. But I think, really hearing from you once landing on those principles in terms of honoring their existence, how you see the actionable space and requirement, because I think we also want to talk about it through the lens of a requirement. And it's not just, oh, it's a principle that, from a wordsmithing space is strong. It's a principle that is only as impactful as the action and requirement that it so seeks. So I'd love to hear from the two of you on the principles.
Yeah, thank you. I think the last thing that you said really spoke to us. It's just that these principles are really wonderful to read and really important, but what actually matters is the application of them, and it really doesn't mean much unless they're applied in these spaces that they're being asked to be applied in. I think us adopting these principles was really coming from a place of who are we, again, as two white Jewish women, to dictate what needs to happen to make our spaces more inclusive to Jews of color when they're literally being explicitly laid out by Black Jews in this letter for us. So it was more let's take them and actually bring them to our white Jewish communities and be we're literally being given the tools to make the changes that are being asked of us. So how can we support you in making these changes that are quite literally laid out for us? And I think over time, we've also developed our own anti-oppressive Jewish values. We've also begun to really center anti-Zionism in our work. That's really important to us as an anti-oppressive organization, and definitely was not one of our starting principles. It's more where we've grown to over time and where we've begun to see importance as a white Jewish organization doing this anti-oppressive work. But in terms of like specific steps around each of the principles, I think for the first one, it seems really simple, but is more complicated than it maybe should be. But that was the first step that we took when we were working and when we work one-on-one with synagogues and organizations. It's just like, you need to release this statement, have it on your website, have it as part of like your temple values explicitly stated. And not everyone is on board with that. There's a lot of conversation around like whether Black Lives Matter is supportive of Israel or not. And for a lot of Jews, that was like really a block. And so we were breaking down the difference between like, okay, if you don't agree with an organization's values, you can still agree with the idea that Black lives do matter.
Right, because the first point says without caveat or qualification. That's it. That was the line. And still people come to us and they're like, well, can we just say like anti-racist instead? And it was like, we really felt the pushback. We were like, no, the principle says this. But communities still settle where they feel they can appropriately, lovingly challenge one another. So that is definitely a part of this, where we set the principle and then people say, oh, well, we can't do that. And it's really a challenge, especially when we get down to the kind of the leadership development and the grantees and where money goes. Now is not a particularly
abundant.
Yeah, I was gonna say like a thriving time for a lot of religious spaces, but particularly after the pandemic and membership has gone down and economic downturn, a lot of Jewish spaces are like, look, we're doing what we can. Which I've always had some frustration with, like, oh, everyone's doing their best, because I think sometimes that's an excuse for complacency. But we say, okay, so you can't commit to, changing your entire board membership right now. Fine. Then what are you doing about point 2 and doing some, creating this pillar of racial equality? What is your investment in the curriculum? That doesn't take a lot of money. Like, we'll rewrite your curriculum for you if you want to, like we say there's always a starting point with these principles. You don't have to commit to every type of shifting your funding and shifting, all your principles at the same time. It's it's over the course of years that this is supposed to be applied, and it's supposed to be sustainable. Because if you change everything at once, it won't be sustainable.
Yeah. So really like thinking about these principles is like ongoing steps and like, okay, start somewhere and like, where can we move from there? And how can we make sure that we're like encouraging this to be a continuing conversation and like action that's taking place.
And what I hear is really truly a phased integration. It's really making sure that the sustainability component is extremely important, because as you said, you don't want, we definitely don't want check-in box. You don't for the sake of, or just saying, okay, well, we tried, but you really do want an ongoing integration of the principle. So for example, making sure that there's the pillar of racial equity, or even saying out loud kind of the voice and vision around the words Black Lives Matter, or even redesigning the curriculum. You want it to be able to stand. You want it to be something that is adopted and integrated in an intentional way that lives perhaps even beyond, because if what I'm hearing is correct, you want entities to build their own internal capacity to be able to exact, I think is what we want, to exact the principles, to be familiar with them, to know them, to so seek to apply them, but to be able to exact them in an intentional way that lives beyond the initial conversations. And I think when we introduce the social justice conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we have our natural touch points that we can see living within the principles that you guys have so stated with your work, and in the Not Free to Desist letter, I think that the sustainability piece is huge. And I think it's an area that we have to just give a little more forethought to, because as you said, that you do a big overhaul and the big overhaul can fall on its face. But there is a stair-stepped model, perhaps a phased integration. We see, because what we want is efficiency and success. So thank you both for talking through the principles, but even more so the actionable space, what we so seek, not just in verb, verbiage, but also in action as well. That takes us nicely to the next question that I wanted to pivot in your direction. What does it take? In your eyes, what does it take for organizations and individuals? Because what we want to talk about today is how diversity, equity, and inclusion, how their natural touch points in our professional spaces, our life spaces as a whole, personally and professionally. So, what does it take for organizations to implement non-band-aid solutions, to cultivate equitable spaces, inclusive spaces, and the creation of an anti-racist culture? So what is your take on that?
I think like something that it has to start with is like this willingness to have uncomfortable conversations, and like Jesse said earlier, like lovingly challenge and also hold our communities accountable, ourselves accountable and our communities accountable during these uncomfortable conversations. And a large part of our work is really just starting with like facilitating and holding these uncomfortable conversations and being like, okay, we all are oppressive. Like we all are holding on to, tenets of white supremacy, and we all are implementing racism in our day-to-day life just by existing as white people in the society that we have. That's like really uncomfortable to unpack for people who are new to this work, who are like, well, I'm not racist because like I have never done this, that, and the other thing. So it's really first like starting at the very beginning where it's like, okay, actually we all are, and like if we're doing a disservice to ourselves and our communities if we're not acknowledging the ways that implicit bias shows up in our everyday lives and in our communities, because like it is showing up in our communities. So it's like providing examples that are given to us by Black Jews, by other Jews of color, non-white Jews, of like microaggressions that take place in Jewish spaces, or even like outwardly racist practices that take place in Jewish spaces, and being like, these things are happening. And like maybe to you asking someone about their hair, which is a very like common example, but like super real, like maybe to you that was fine, but actually like let's unpack why that's not okay. And so just starting with those conversations and allowing people to be like really vulnerable, and like for us to be vulnerable and be like, here are times that we've also made these mistakes, because like we are all human and working through the same society and like trying to do better. So like starting there and then moving into like, okay, we've had some really uncomfortable conversations and we're going to keep having them, but how can we also add action to this, which is something we've been talking about this whole time. But I think that the combination of those two is really where like this non-band-aid solution comes in, where it's like we're not just having a conversation and then leaving. It's like we're having a conversation and then being like, okay, now that we understand this, what can we actually do differently in our spaces, and like how can we change our spaces? How can we call in our loved ones? How can we call out our loved ones? What do you want to add?
Yeah, no, I think that was all really good. The vulnerability, especially because that's been something that has really grown with the workshops we've done, is once we show like, okay, guys, we're going to talk about microaggressions and let's like delve in. This is something that's happened to me, and then this is something I reproduced unknowingly, right? Like we can be both, victims of anti-Semitism and perpetrators of white supremacy. And so really like kind of sealing that in as like, this is the ground floor. Now let's go up from there. Like, and kind of, there are people who don't want to get on board with that, but like, that's where we start, and let's go together. I also want to note that a lot of Jewish spaces I've been in have actually been pretty accessible to people of different abilities throughout kind of my experience with Jewish spaces, whether it's wheelchair ramps that go up to the bima or into the building, Braille prayer books, which is really cool. A lot of reform groups I've seen do kind of like an inclusive Shabbat service at least once a month, where they invite people of all abilities and people of all ages. And those are all amazing steps to kind of create inclusivity. I think the problem is when it stops there. Like, yep, we checked our box, like you said, we did our one service of the month, and kind of using those moments as a jumping off point. Like, okay, this is accessible in a physical space to a group of people, but is the service accessible in the kind of emotional and spiritual space? Like, for example, at these services, do you have name tags so people who haven't been a part of the congregation for 20 years feel comfortable to approach you and say, hi, because any group that's been around for 20 years gets a little clicky, and like, is it actually accessible? Do you have gender pronouns on those name tags? Does somebody have to have the awkward conversation with someone trying to guess their gender? Like, all of these ways that there is an existing structure for most things, it's pushing it further. Then we get into, okay, so more people are coming into our space that are diverse and different from us. Now, how do we promote their development and make sure they're in charge and make sure they have things to say? Because you won't get a diverse congregation unless you create the space and the opportunity for diversity to thrive.
Right. Like, diversity is great, but it means nothing unless the space is inclusive. Because like, if we're inviting, people of diverse identities into our spaces,
just to harm them.
Right. If they're not safe, if they're being harmed in those spaces, if like something happens, then they don't feel welcomed back, or they don't want to come back, then it doesn't mean anything that the space was diverse or is diverse.
Right. No, I mean, I think some absolutely excellent points. We take the terms separately, but they cannot be applied in silos, right? So we will often say DEI work in that singular phrase, but it becomes mission critical to really take those words together in terms of application. And I think the social justice conversation, as we continue to see it evolve, there's opportunities where language is exceptionally powerful. But I think as we recognize how impactful language is, we've got to recognize kind of the intent with the language, right? And so, creating natural spaces of inclusivity, making sure that it's just not in word, but it's also in deed, is how you create the culture. And that's how you get past the non-band-aids, the band-aid solutions, to evolve past to the space of the non-band-aid solution, because it becomes ongoing practice. It's operational. I mean, you both said something as you're responding to kind of what can organizations do, is you facilitate the conversation, but then you stay there. And that's on purpose. You stay there. You don't just have the conversation, then exit stage left. You introduce the conversation, you facilitate it, and it's uncomfortable. And yes, that's what this looks like. However, introducing the uncomfortable conversation and staying there is how you really is how the rubber meets the road. That's how you really create that inclusive space that becomes a part of kind of your ongoing way of being, quite simply. So thank you both so much for an exceptional conversation today. Is there anything additional that you would like to share around Making Mentions, your work? Is so excited to just introduce and showcase just the phenomenal work that you're doing around, welcoming communities of color, specifically the one we're talking about, the Jewish experience. And I think that, the work in and of itself, it weds concepts of the systemic nature of anti-Blackness in Jewish spaces, and think that is definitely something from a social justice dialogue conversation that needs to be showcased. So thank you both. Anything additional?
Yeah, I mean, just like some things that I would add are like that was our main focus, just making it clear to everyone that the Jewish experience is sort of like homogenized by media, and in the United States especially, to like look white and look a certain way. There's like a phrase, Ashkenormativity, which we did not come up with. We did not come up with that. That is credited to someone, we don't know who came up with it. It's just sort of a phrase that flies around. But this like idea that Jews are all Ashkenazi Jews, which is like Eastern European Jews, they all like have the same features, but like there is such a wide range of Jewish experience and Jewish identity, and by no means is that experience largely white. And so it's really a matter of like bringing awareness to the fact that like there are plenty of Jews who are not white, and their experiences are so critical to like understanding Judaism. And on top of that, like Jewish values have always promoted this work. Like these are values that are inherent to Judaism as a spiritual space. The value of tikkun olam, which is repairing the world, like these are values that we talk about all the time in Judaism, and that we're just bringing into like this space, the values of tzedek, which is literally the value of justice and like a more just world, and that which is truth. B'Tselem Elohim, which is like being made in the image of God. So the idea that we're all made in the image of God. So like, again, that relates back a lot to concept of race and identity. All of these values and like so many others, literally countless others, are such like core tenets to Judaism. And it's like, we really want to be encouraging Jews to be like, these are things that we're taught from day one as part of our Judaism. So like, why are we not actually applying them actively in our day-to-day lives? Like, when did we stray from like the actual meaning of what it means to be a Jewish person and like care about our communities and like the world and like repair it, literally repairing the world. So that's what I would add. Do you want to talk about our upcoming workshop?
Oh yes. Well, first, I just want to name too the writers behind the Not Free to Desist letter to make sure they're like individuals associated who did this work. Rachel Sumek, Aaron Samuels, and Lindsay Newman, who all do their own amazing individual work as well. Yes, we do have an upcoming workshop specifically around, this is perfect, you were like in my brain, because in a few weeks, we have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is the start of our new Jewish year. And the month before is a time of reflection. It's the month of Elul, and you're supposed to be kind of reflecting on how you live your life and the choices we make and what we want to really think about during the high holidays. And so we're holding an event about having harmonious high holidays, how to engage in difficult discussions that come up when you're with family or with friends or over Zoom around the high holidays. And so it is on Tuesday, August 24th. I almost said the 25th, so that was good. And it's from 5 to 7 p.m. We're doing it on Zoom. It's open to anybody. We're not regionally specific this time like we have been with our other projects. And we just really want to kind of give a space for people to show up and say, I'm really nervous that fat phobia is going to come up at my dinner, or I'm nervous that we're going to talk about money issues, or we're going to talk about race and I don't know what to say and how do I process, and kind of dealing with like self-care around those difficult discussions too. So we would love to see anybody and everybody there.
Yeah, any Jewish folks who are struggling to figure out how they're going to have conversations around anything that's come up in the past year or two with their loved ones is super welcome to come.
Well, thank you both so much. Just definitely super grateful for the fact that when you were witnessing calls for racial injustice in this country, that you felt the need to act and to bring change with the creation of Making Mentions. So thank you both so much. And closing out for today, thank you all to our listeners. Thank you for tuning in. As a reminder, the Equity Summit will be virtual. It is going to be held on February 8th through the 10th, 2022. Again, log on to theequitysummit.com and purchase tickets today. Thank you very much.